Let's get into adding decimals. So when you add decimals, all you do is line up the decimal points, fill in the gaps with zeros, and add. Let's look at the first example. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to line up the decimal points. And notice with 15, you see the decimal point to the right? It's no different than if I was giving you money. If it's a whole number, the decimal point will always be to the right of that number. And then from there, you just fill in the gaps with zeros, and you add, and that's your answer. Let's look at the second example. So once again, we're going to line up our decimal points. Notice the decimal point on 6 is no different than if I was giving you $6. The decimal point will be to the right of it. From there, we fill in your zeros and you add, and there's your answer. So that's how you add decimals. Let's get into subtracting decimals. So just like addition, you make sure your decimal points are lined up, you fill in your gaps with zeros, and you subtract. So looking at the first example, line up your decimal points, fill in your gaps with zeros, and subtract. And there's your first answer. Looking at the second problem, once again, you line up your decimal points, fill in your gaps with zeros, and subtract. Now, unlike addition, it is optional to put in zeros when you do addition. With subtraction, you have to put in your zeros, otherwise you won't know when to borrow. And that's the answer for the second one. Looking at the third problem, once again, you're going to line up your decimal points. Once again, for a whole number, the decimal point is to the right of it. Fill in your gaps and subtract. And that's all you do for subtracting decimals. Let's get into multiplying decimals. So the first step you do when you multiply decimals is you multiply the numbers. So you can already see how 12 times 11 is worked out. And notice how the other two are worked out the exact same way. The reason being is you don't worry about lining up the decimal points. You just simply multiply the numbers. All right. We only worry about the decimal points when we're finished at the end of the problem. So for the first step, just multiply like you normally would. Now that we're done multiplying, now we worry about the decimal points. Next step is you add up the decimal places in each number. And finally, you move the decimal point in your answer. So let's look at the first problem. So let's add up the total number of decimal places in those two numbers. There's 0 decimal places in the first number, 0 decimal places in the second number. That means there's a total of 0 decimal places to move. So therefore, the answer is just like that, 132. Looking at the second problem, the first number has 1 decimal place to the right. The other number has 0 decimal places. So we're going to move a total of 1 decimal place. So we move 1 decimal place over, and the final answer is 13.2. Looking at the third problem, both of the decimals have 1 decimal place to the right. So therefore, we're going to move a total of 2 decimal places. Moving 2 decimal places, you're going to have a final answer of 1.32. So let's look at 3 other examples. So once again, you see how they're all multiplied out the same way, and we don't care how the decimal points are lined up. And obviously, it's just 12 times 11, which is 132. Now let's worry about the decimal points. For the first problem, it's got 0 decimal places for the first number. It's got 1 decimal place to the right for the second number. So we move a total of 1 decimal place. And the final answer is 13.2. Looking at the second problem, it's got 2 decimal places to the right. The second decimal has 1 decimal place to the right. So we're going to move a total of 3 decimal places. And the final answer is 0.132. For the last problem, both decimals have 2 places to the right of the decimal point. So we're going to move a total of 4 decimal places. Notice how we have a gap there after moving 4 places. You just fill it in with a 0. And the final answer will be 0.0132, and that's how you multiply decimals. So now we're going to take a look at dividing decimals. And there's 2 different situations you have to look out for when you divide decimals. The first situation is when you have a whole number on the outside, and the second situation is when you have a decimal on the outside, and it has to be handled differently. Now I want you to look at the top left corner, and you see how that little division problem changes into long division? The first car always goes into the garage. In other words, the first number in any division problem always goes inside, even if it's the smaller number. So just keep that in mind when we go through these examples. So let's start off for when there's a whole number on the outside. So when there's a whole number on the outside of the division, you can go ahead and do it. Just move the decimal point to the top and divide. So looking at this first example, it's just normal long division. You're doing 3 going into 267, you get 89. It's no different with decimals. First, we set up the division, and we can see that there's a whole number on the outside. That's okay. You line your decimal point up to the top, and then you work it out. The final answer is 0.89. Let's move to the next example. Now let's look at the case where you're dividing by a decimal. So when the number on the outside is a decimal, you can't do the division. You have to first change the decimal to a whole number, and then you can do the division. Let's look at this example. Looking at this problem, let's set it up. Oh, we got a problem. There's a decimal on the outside. So what you're going to have to do is shift the decimal point to the right until it becomes a whole number. So we got to shift it one place to the right. Now, whatever you do to the outside, you have to also do to the inside. So we also have to shift it to the right one place on the inside. So now the new problem will become 3 going into 26.7. Now the outside is a whole number, so now we can do the division, and the final answer will be 8.9. Looking at the second problem, let's set it up. Once again, we have a problem. There's a decimal on the outside, so we'll need to shift the decimal point. In this case, we'll need to shift it over 3 times. Whatever you do to the outside, you do to the inside. So we'll also shift it on the inside 3 times. Notice that there's a gap. We'll just fill that gap with a 0. And so now the new problem becomes 3 going into 2,670. The outside is a whole number. It's okay. We can do the division. The final answer will be 890. And that's how you divide decimals. Now, there are cases where dividing decimals do get more complicated. And so what I will do is I will leave a link in the description, and you can see the video where we go through a full overview of dividing decimals. But you have the general idea on how to do them. Now that we're done, you can do something more useful with your time, like have some dinner. But if the dinner plate starts moving by itself, you'd better call Ghostbusters. I don't want nothing to do with that. Like and share. Map on the fly. Laters.